Most of the things around you were designed. Someone decided what they should do and then made them do it. But not all of them. Some things were not designed at all. They were noticed. Somebody was working on one problem, and something went wrong in an interesting way. A batch was ruined. A dish was left out. A machine did the wrong thing quietly in a corner. And instead of throwing it away, one person looked closer. Tonight we are going to walk through 14 of those moments. They are spread across 130 years, in laboratories and workshops, and one very ordinary kitchen. None of these people set out to make the thing they are remembered for. There is no rush in any of this. You do not have to follow every detail. If you are here to fall asleep, that is a perfectly good way to listen. We will start in 1839 with a man who had already failed at this many times. The rubber that melted every summer. Natural rubber has an old problem. In the cold, it turns hard and brittle. In the heat, it turns soft and sticky. A rubber shoe that worked in April would be a sad puddle by July. Charles Goodyear spent years trying to fix this. He was not a chemist. He was a man with an idea and a great deal of stubbornness. He mixed rubber with almost anything he could find. Magnesia, lime, nitric acid. He went into debt. He was jailed for those debts more than once and kept experimenting while he was in there. One winter, he was working with a mixture of rubber and sulfur. The usual story is that some of it landed on a hot stove. What he saw was not the mess he expected. The rubber did not melt into syrup. It charred at the very edge, and the part just inside had changed. It had become firm and springy, and it stayed that way as it cooled. Heat and sulfur together had done something that neither could do alone. It took him several more years to work out how much heat and for how long. The process is called vulcanization. It is the reason a car tire can sit in a desert without turning to glue and start the morning in frost without cracking. Goodyear himself never made money from it. He died in debt. The tire company that carries his name was founded almost 40 years after his death by people who simply admired him. The chemist who did not wash his hands. Konstantin Fahlberg was working at Johns Hopkins University on coal tar derivatives. This is ordinary industrial chemistry. Coal tar is a thick residue left over from making coke, and it turns out to contain a great many useful compounds. He went home for dinner, and the bread tasted sweet. He asked about it, and nobody else noticed anything unusual. He tried his napkin, and that was sweet too. He worked out that the sweetness was on his own hands, and that he had brought it from the laboratory. The next day he went back and, by his own account, tasted his way along the bench until he found the flask. This was a normal thing to do at the time, and a very alarming thing to read about now. The compound he found is saccharin. It is several hundred times sweeter than sugar, and the body does not process it, which means it carries no calories. Its history since then has been unusually turbulent. It was restricted during sugar shortages, then encouraged, then suspected of causing cancer in rats in the 1970s, then cleared decades later when it turned out the effect did not carry across to humans. Warning labels were required and then removed. It is still made, and it is still one of the sweetest things a person can put in a cup of tea. Wheat that was left out. John Harvey Kellogg ran a sanitarium in Battle Creek, Michigan. It was a health retreat, and the diet there was strict, plain, and mostly grain-based. He and his brother Will were looking for something easier to eat than the hard-baked products they had been serving. They had boiled a batch of wheat and then were called away. By the time they came back to it, the wheat had been sitting for hours and had gone stale. Rather than waste it, they pushed it through the rollers anyway, expecting a single sheet of dough. It did not come out as a sheet. Each grain came out separately, as a thin flake. The waiting had done it. The moisture had had time to spread evenly through every grain, and that even moisture is what let each one flatten on its own, instead of merging with its neighbors. They toasted the flakes and had something light and crisp that patients could actually enjoy. The brothers disagreed at length and eventually in court about what to do next. John wanted it to remain a health food. Will wanted to add sugar and sell it to everybody. Will founded the company, and Will was right about the market. The cereal aisle in every supermarket descends from a pot of wheat that somebody forgot about. Glass that holds together. Edouard Benedictus was a French chemist, and by most accounts a slightly disorganized one. He had a flask on a high shelf that he had used some time before and never properly cleaned. It had held a solution of cellulose nitrate, an early plastic. The liquid had long since evaporated, leaving a thin, clear film on the inside of the glass. One day, the flask fell. It should have shattered across the floor. Instead, it cracked, held its shape, and stayed in one piece. The web of cracks was there, but the pieces had nowhere to go. The invisible film inside was holding them. At that time, cars were new, and windscreens were ordinary glass. In a crash, the glass did not just break. It became a spray of blades. Benedictus had read about exactly that kind of injury, and the flask on his floor was suddenly a different object. He worked out how to put a plastic layer deliberately between two sheets of glass and press them together. That is laminated glass, and it is still made on that principle today. The car industry was slow to take it. It was expensive, and safety was not yet something people paid for. Laminated glass found its first real use in the eyepieces of gas masks in the First World War. The windscreens came later. The dish that was not cleaned. Alexander Fleming was studying Staphylococcus bacteria at St. Mary's Hospital in London. He was, by his own admission, untidy. He went away on holiday in September and left a stack of culture dishes on a bench. When he came back, one of them had been contaminated. A mold had got in. That happens constantly, and the normal response is to throw the dish away. Fleming looked at it first. Around the patch of mold there was a clear ring. The bacteria that filled the rest of the dish simply were not there, in a neat halo around the intruder. Something the mold was producing was killing them. The mold was from the genus Penicillium. He called the substance penicillin. Here is the part that is usually skipped. Fleming published his finding, and then largely moved on. He could grow the mold, but he could not extract enough of the active substance to treat anybody. For over 10 years, it stayed a laboratory curiosity. It became a medicine because of a team at Oxford in the late 1930s and early 40s. Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, Norman Heatley, and others worked out how to purify it and make it in quantity at a moment when the world very badly needed it. Heatley grew it in whatever containers he could find, including hospital bedpans. The accident was Fleming's. The medicine took a decade and a large group of people. The gas that disappeared. Roy Plunkett was 27, working for DuPont on new refrigerant gases. He had a cylinder of tetrafluoroethylene that had been stored on dry ice overnight. In the morning, he opened the valve. Nothing came out. The cylinder still weighed the same as a full one. The gas had not leaked. He could have written it off as a faulty valve and moved on. Instead, he had the cylinder cut open. Inside was a white, waxy powder coating the walls. The gas had polymerized. The small molecules had joined into long chains and turned into a solid. The solid turned out to be remarkable. Almost nothing stuck to it. Almost nothing corroded it. It tolerated heat that destroyed other plastics. It was extraordinarily slippery. DuPont named it Teflon. Its first serious job was not a frying pan. It was the Manhattan Project, where they needed seals and linings that would survive uranium hexafluoride, a substance that eats most materials. Teflon was one of the few things that could sit in that stream and be ignored by it. The kitchen came afterwards, in the 1950s, when a French engineer's wife suggested putting it on cookware. Burrs on a Dog. Georges de Mestral was a Swiss engineer. He went walking in the Alps with his dog and came home with burdock burrs stuck to his trousers and to the dog's coat. This is an ordinary annoyance. Everyone who has walked through long grass knows it. You pull them off and forget about them. De Mestral put one under a microscope. What he saw was not a sticky surface or a barb driven in. It was a field of tiny hooks. Each hook was curved at the end, and it had simply caught in the loops of the fabric and in the curls of the dog's fur. Nothing was glued. Nothing was pierced. Two textures had met, and one held the other. He decided he could make that on purpose. It took him roughly a decade. The hard part was not the idea. It was manufacturing. He needed a way to weave thousands of tiny loops and then cut them into hooks at exactly the right shape, in a material that would not wear out after 20 uses. He settled on nylon and found that nylon woven under infrared light held its hook shape. He called it Velcro, from the French words for velvet and hook. For years, it was seen as a novelty. It became ordinary partly through aerospace, where a fastener you can work with thick gloves on has obvious appeal. The spring that walked. Richard James was a naval engineer working on ways to keep sensitive instruments steady on ships at sea. Rough water shakes everything, and delicate equipment does not like being shaken. He was testing springs that might absorb that movement. One of the springs fell off a shelf. It did not clatter to the floor. It tipped end over end, moved down a stack of books, onto a tabletop, and settled itself upright on the floor. He took it home and showed his wife Betty. She spent some time with a dictionary, looking for the right word for something that moves that way. She chose slinky. They borrowed $500, had $400 made, and could not sell them. A department store in Philadelphia let them set up a demonstration before Christmas 1945. Richard set up an inclined board and let the spring walk down it. They sold all 400 in about 90 minutes. The design has barely changed since. It is still a flat coil of steel, and it still does the only trick it has ever done. The chocolate in the pocket. Percy Spencer worked for Raytheon on magnetrons, the tubes that generate the microwaves used in radar. He had almost no formal education. He had learned electronics largely by taking things apart, and he was very good at it. One day he was standing near an active magnetron and noticed that a sweet in his pocket had gone soft. Standing near a warm machine and finding melted chocolate is not, on its own, interesting. What made it interesting is what Spencer did next. He did not assume it was the heat coming off the equipment. He tested it. He sent for popcorn kernels and held them near the tube they popped. The next morning he brought in an egg. Accounts differ on exactly who was standing where, but the egg burst. He had worked out that the microwaves were not warming the surface and waiting for the heat to travel inwards. They were agitating water molecules throughout the food at once. That is why it cooked so quickly, and why it cooked from everywhere at the same time. The first commercial microwave oven went on sale in 1947. It stood nearly as tall as a person, weighed several hundred kilograms, and needed plumbing because it was water-cooled. It cost about as much as a car. It took another 20 years of shrinking before one would sit on a kitchen counter. Too sticky to be useful. Harry Coover was working on clear plastics for gun sights during the Second World War. One of the compounds he was testing was a cyanoacrylate. It stuck to everything it touched, instantly and permanently, and it ruined the equipment it was tested on. That made it useless for a gun sight. It was set aside. 9 years later, Coover was working on heat-resistant canopies for jet aircraft, and cyanoacrylates came up again. A colleague, Fred Joyner, spread some between the two prisms of a refractometer to measure it. The prisms bonded. They were expensive, and they were now one object. This time, Coover recognized what he had. The thing that made the compound a failure was the only thing anybody needed from it. It required no heat, no pressure, and no mixing. It simply needed the trace of moisture that sits on almost every surface. It went on sale in 1958. Its most striking use came later, in medicine. A version of the same chemistry can close a wound without stitches, and it was used in the field during the Vietnam War to hold injuries together long enough to get people to a surgeon. Wallpaper cleaner for children. Before central heating was common, many homes were heated by coal. Coal soot settled on everything, including wallpaper, and wallpaper of that period could not be washed. So there was a product for it, a soft, pale, putty-like compound. You rolled it over the wall and the soot came away with it. A company in Cincinnati called Kutol made a great deal of it. Then homes changed. Gas and oil heating spread. Wallpaper became washable. The soot problem quietly disappeared, and so did the market. The company was in serious trouble. The turn came from a family connection. A relative of the company's owners taught nursery school and mentioned that the modeling clay available to schools was hard for small hands to work. The wallpaper cleaner, she pointed out, was soft, non-toxic, and reusable. They took the same compound, removed the detergent, added color and a scent, and sold it as a toy. It became Play-Doh. The product barely changed. What changed was who it was for. The wrong component. Wilson Greatbatch was building a device to record the sound of a heartbeat. It was a small circuit, and it needed a resistor of a particular value. He reached into a box and fitted the wrong one. Instead of recording, the circuit began to produce a pulse of its own. It ran for 1.5 milliseconds, paused for a second, and pulsed again. He recognized the rhythm immediately because it was almost exactly the rhythm of a human heart. Pacemakers existed at the time, but they were external machines, some of them mains-powered, and a patient was tethered to one. Greatbatch had, by mistake, built a pulse generator small enough to consider putting inside a person. He spent 2 years on it in a barn behind his house, living on very little. The first implantable pacemaker was fitted to a patient in 1960. The early ones ran for a couple of years before the battery gave out. Greatbatch later worked on the lithium battery chemistry that extended that to a decade or more, which mattered as much as the circuit did, because every replacement meant another operation. The wallpaper nobody wanted. Alfred Fielding and Mark Chavons were trying to make a modern wall covering. Their idea was to seal two shower curtains together in a way that trapped air between them, producing a plastic wallpaper with texture. It worked. Nobody wanted it. They tried again. The same material, they thought, would make good greenhouse insulation. That did not take either. The third attempt was the one. IBM had just announced a new computer, and computers of that size had to be shipped, and shipping meant vibration and impact. Somebody made the connection between fragile machines and a sheet full of trapped air. In 1959, the material began protecting IBM machines in transit. The company that made it is called Sealed Air, and it is still a large business. It is worth sitting with the shape of that story. The product was not changed to succeed. The bubbles were the same bubbles. It failed twice because it was pointed at the wrong problem, and it succeeded the moment somebody pointed it at the right one. The glue that was not strong enough. Spencer Silver was a chemist at 3M, trying to develop a very strong adhesive for aircraft construction. In 1968, he produced something that was the opposite of what he was aiming for. It stuck, but weakly. You could peel it off. Then you could stick it down again, and it would still work. It left nothing behind. By any normal measure, this was a failed adhesive. Silver did not think so. He spent about 5 years inside the company, giving talks about it, trying to find somebody who could think of a use. Nobody could. The use arrived through a colleague, Art Fry, who sang in a church choir. He marked hymns with scraps of paper, and the scraps kept falling out. He wanted a bookmark that would stay put and then come away without damaging the page. He remembered Silver's adhesive. The product still took years. Coating one side of paper so that it peels cleanly every time, without tearing, is harder than it sounds. Early test markets did badly, mostly because people could not tell what the thing was for until they had one on their desk. 3M eventually gave away large numbers of free samples in one city, and the reorder rate settled the argument. The Post-it note went on general sale in 1980. 12 years after the glue, and 6 years after somebody thought of the bookmark. 14 stories, and a pattern runs through most of them. The accident is rarely the interesting part. Mold lands in dishes all the time. Springs fall off shelves. Batches are ruined in every laboratory in the world, every week. What is rare is somebody stopping, looking at the ruined thing, and asking what it is good at instead of what it failed at. And then there is the second part, which is slower and much less romantic. 10 years between Fleming's dish and a usable medicine. A decade for de Mestral to work out how to weave a hook. 12 years between a weak glue and a product on a shelf. 9 years before anybody wanted a glue that stuck too well. The moment of noticing makes the story. The years afterwards make the object. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.